Imagine waking up, checking your portfolio, and seeing the best stock market performance in years. I mean, you'd probably feel like the economy is entering this like golden age, right?
Yeah, you'd think everything is perfect.
Exactly. But then you open the front page of the news and it's chaos. You're looking at a 63-day kinetic global war, a blockaded ocean completely strangling international shipping, and on top of that, a massive brand new transatlantic trade war.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because today is May 9, 2026, and honestly, the global economy is just suffering from this severe cognitive dissonance. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Our
Wow.
mission today is to take this huge stack of sources we have, spanning geopolitics, monetary policy, corporate earnings, and decode what analysts are calling this trimodal risk environment.
Which is such a fascinating term because really the central mystery we're unpacking for you today is this glaring paradox. Like how
Yeah.
on earth can the U.S. stock market hit all-time absolute record highs on the exact same day that the global geopolitical architecture basically seems to be catching fire?
Yeah, it's like well, the analogy I keep thinking of is imagine you're driving this incredible luxury sports car, right? And you're going like 150 miles per hour down the highway.
Okay.
But the check engine light is just flashing red and the cabin is literally filling with smoke. That's what the global economy feels like today.
That's actually a really perfect way to describe it because it is the defining macroeconomic paradox of our time. What we're seeing is this profound decoupling between the illusions presented by financial indices and the gritty, often painful reality of the underlying global economy.
Right. The numbers on the screen don't match the reality on the ground.
Exactly. And to understand this, we have to look through the lens of two very specific concepts that come up in our sources today. That's market bifurcation and capital resilience.
Okay, break those down for us.
Well, basically, we are living in an era where companies with massive cash reserves and artificial intelligence capabilities, they're functionally operating in a completely different economic gravity than traditional capital-heavy businesses.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, the traditional economy is out there absorbing all these shocks, right? The inflation, the protectionism, the war. But the tech economy is somehow just floating above it all.
It's just floating above the smoke. So let's test that illusion of the index idea right away because the closing bells just rang for May 1st, and the numbers present this really fascinating contradiction.
Oh, absolutely. The split screen today is wild.
It really is. I mean, April was historically strong. The sources show the S&P was up 10.4%, the Nasdaq was up 15.3%, and the Dow jumped 7.1%. Best month since 2020. But today, specifically, the Nasdaq and the S&P 500 closed at fresh record highs, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average actually dropped into negative territory.
Right.
So to a casual listener, the stock market went up and down simultaneously. Make the math on that make sense.
Yeah, it sounds impossible, but it comes down to the actual architectural DNA of the indices themselves, which honestly, financial media rarely bothers to explain.
Hmm.
So the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq are what we call capitalization-weighted indices.
Okay, and that means what exactly?
The math is pretty simple. The total market value of the company dictates its influence on the index. So a massive multi-trillion-dollar company moving by just a fraction of a percent exerts this immense gravitational pull on the entire index.
Right, so the huge guys just drag everything else with them.
Exactly. It can completely obscure the fact that dozens of smaller companies in that exact same index might be losing money that day. Basically, the index reflects the whales, not the ocean.
Okay, so a few titans mask the weakness underneath, but the Dow Jones is different, right?
Very different. The Dow Jones is, frankly, a statistical relic from the late 19th century. Charles Dow created it before modern computing, so he used price weighting.
Price weighting.
Yeah, meaning the influence a company has on the Dow is dictated entirely by the absolute dollar price of a single share of its stock, regardless of how big the company actually is.
Wait, really? So a company with a share price of like $300 has 6 times more influence on the daily movement of the index than a company with a share price of $50.
Exactly. Even if that $50 company generates 10 times more revenue overall, the $300 stock moves the needle more.
Which perfectly explains today's split screen in our sources. It's essentially the tale of two companies today, right? Apple and Amgen.
Yep, those two are the perfect case study. Apple just reported its Q2 earnings, and this is the first quarter fully managed by their new CEO, John Ternus.
And the numbers were huge.
Staggering. Despite historic headwinds in China, demand for the iPhone 17 there is surprisingly robust. But the specific metric that set the market on fire was their gross margin. It landed between 47.5% and 48.5%.
Which is wild, achieving nearly 50% profitability on the manufacturing and sale of physical hardware at a global scale. That's almost unprecedented.
It really is. And because Apple commands roughly a 10% weight in the Nasdaq and a 6% weight in the S&P 500, its 4.5% stock jump today acted like a rocket booster for those two specific indices.
Okay, so that's the S&P and the Nasdaq soaring. But then we look at the biotech giant Amgen over on the Dow.
Right. And Amgen actually beat their earnings estimates today.
Oh, they did?
They did. However, their management issued very modest forward guidance. Basically, they told Wall Street not to expect massive growth in the next quarter. And investors punished the stock for it, sending it down nearly 6%.
And here is where the 19th century math kicks in.
Exactly. Amgen's share price sits well over $300. Apple's is significantly lower in absolute dollar terms, even though Apple is a vastly larger corporation.
Right.
So Amgen's high nominal share price means its 6% drop acted like an anchor. It was heavy enough to drag the entire 30-stock Dow index into the red.
Wow. It's such a brilliant reminder for you listening. When a headline says, the market is up, you really have to ask, which mathematical formula is up and who is manipulating the variables?
You really do.
But, we can't talk about Apple's margins without looking at the broader structural force keeping those capitalization-weighted indices at record highs. I'm looking at the Q1 earnings sources for the broader big tech AI boom, specifically Alphabet and Meta. And honestly, the scale is difficult to wrap my head around.
Oh, the numbers represent a fundamental shift in how corporate value is actually generated.
Yeah.
Alphabet didn't just beat expectations. They reported an 82% year-over-year jump in earnings per share.
82%. That's huge.
Huge. Their top-line revenue hit $109.9 billion for the quarter. But, and this is the most critical data point, look at their $467.6 billion cloud backlog.
Yeah, explain that backlog, because that's not just money in the bank right now, right?
Right. That isn't current revenue. That is guaranteed future income, locked in by enterprise clients who are just desperate for AI computing power.
Yeah.
Alphabet is officially transitioning from, consumer search engine into the foundational infrastructure of the global AI economy.
And Meta's narrative is pretty similar looking at our sources. They posted 33% revenue growth, which is their highest quarterly jump in 5 years, while simultaneously increasing the average price of their advertisements by 12%.
Yeah, they are firing on all cylinders.
Okay, but I have to push back here for a second. Those revenue numbers are incredible, sure, but the expenditure numbers in our sources look like the budget of a sovereign military. I mean, Alphabet is projecting $180 to $190 billion in AI capital expenditures.
It's a massive amount of capital.
And Meta is doubling their capex to up to $145 billion, specifically citing the skyrocketing costs of memory chips and GPUs required to train these massive models. So my question is, are we just buying into Silicon Valley utopianism here to mask what is essentially a massive speculative debt bubble? Like, how long can investors cheer for companies that are spending hundreds of billions of dollars on servers before demanding an actual return on investment?
That is the single most debated question on Wall Street right now, without a doubt. But you have to look at how they are funding that capital expenditure. And this brings us right back to that core concept of capital resilience.
Okay.
We are witnessing what macroeconomists call a flight to quality. In a really chaotic global environment, institutional investors aren't viewing these mega-cap tech expenditures as reckless gambling. They view them as the construction of moats.
Moats made of silicon and data centers.
Exactly. Moats made of servers. And they're funded entirely by cash. These companies hold balance sheets with cash reserves that literally eclipse the national treasuries of many mid-sized countries.
Wow.
Yeah. They are undertaking the most expensive infrastructure build-out in human history without relying on expensive corporate debt. In an environment where interest rates are hovering near 4%, traditional companies have to borrow money at a massive premium just to grow.
But big tech doesn't.
No, big tech doesn't. They are self-funding their AI evolution. Investors give them a pass on the astronomical capex bill because they fundamentally believe these AI tools will ultimately generate extreme internal efficiency. And that efficiency will allow them to weather macroeconomic storms that will bankrupt their capital-heavy competitors.
Capital resilience, the ability to endure the storm without having to ask the bank for an umbrella.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, we really need to pivot away from the pristine balance sheets of Silicon Valley now because that macroeconomic storm is definitely intensifying. Let's look at the actual gears of the global economy, starting with the surprise shock out of Washington today. We're calling this the May Day tariff bomb.
Yeah, and the timing of this was highly strategic.
Hmm.
May 1st is a public holiday across most of Europe, Labor Day.
Right.
So while European financial centers are closed, President Donald Trump announced a blanket 25% tariff on all cars and trucks imported from the European Union.
Just out of nowhere. Yeah.
Out of nowhere. With a single post on Truth Social, the administration effectively detonated the Turnberry Agreement, the fragile trade pact they signed just last July.
So the administration's official rationale is that Brussels is dragging its feet on compliance, specifically taking too long to ratify the framework that was supposed to lower auto duties down to 15%. But when you look at the actual text of the president's post, he explicitly points out that over $100 billion is currently being invested in U.S. auto plants. And he left this massive loophole.
Oh, the loophole's the whole point.
Right. If a European company produces its vehicles physically inside the United States at one of these new plants, they pay zero tariff.
Yeah, this is a textbook execution of what we call forced localization. Tariffs are so often misunderstood just as a punishment. But in this case, it is an aggressive industrial policy tool.
How so?
Well, by suddenly slapping a 25% premium on European imports, the U.S. is systematically destroying the economic viability of manufacturing a car in Munich or Stuttgart and selling it in Chicago. It forces the executive boards of, BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen into a really brutal binary choice.
Right.
Either surrender your market share in the world's most lucrative consumer economy or physically uproot your supply chains, abandon your European labor force, and relocate your factories onto American soil.
It's like a hyper-aggressive potluck dinner. Like, imagine we agreed last summer to a neighborhood potluck where everyone shares food freely.
Okay, I'm following.
So you walk up to my front door carrying this really complex, expensive casserole. But before I let you in, I demand a $50 cover charge just for the casserole. Unless, you take your raw ingredients into my kitchen, use my oven, pay my electricity bill, and hire my kids as your sous chefs to bake it from scratch inside my house. Only then can you join the party for free.
I love that. That captures the friction perfectly, particularly that element of capturing the labor and the capital investment, your kitchen and your sous chefs. And the diplomatic shockwave in Europe over this has been immediate.
I can imagine.
Bernd Lange, the chairman of the EU Parliament's Trade Committee, he issued a blistering statement calling the move unacceptable. He even explicitly referenced past arbitrary U.S. actions, including that whole diplomatic spat over buying Greenland a few years ago.
Oh, wow. Bringing that back up.
Yeah, bringing it up to paint the administration as an unreliable trading partner. Brussels is not treating this as a mere negotiating tactic. They are preparing a full-on kinetic economic response.
So what does a kinetic economic response from the EU actually look like? Like, what levers can they realistically pull?
The European Union is preparing to target 93 billion euros worth of U.S. exports.
Yeah.
And they do not target randomly. European trade retaliation is surgically designed to inflict maximum political pain. They will target politically sensitive American exports. Burden from key legislative districts, agricultural products for the American heartland, and heavy industrial machinery. If the EU fully freezes the implementation of the Turnberry deal, we're looking at pre-deal tariff rates snapping back into place, which could push duties on these goods as high as 30%.
I want to take a brief pause here just to establish a critical baseline for you, the listener. Our source materials cover deeply polarizing political actions from both the Trump administration and the European Union.
Yes.
Our role on this deep dive is strictly analytical. We are parsing the economic mechanics without endorsing either political strategy. Our focus is purely on the friction. Like, what actually happens to global capital when the world's two largest integrated economies suddenly erect 25% barriers overnight?
And mechanically, the immediate result of that friction is structural inflation.
Mm-hmm.
Tariffs, at their core, act as a consumption tax. A modern automobile is this miracle of integrated logistics. Its components might cross international borders half a dozen times before final assembly.
So when you fracture that...
Exactly. When you fracture that supply chain with a 25% tariff, you are inherently prioritizing national security and domestic labor over global economic efficiency. And that inefficiency has a literal price tag. It increases the cost of production, which is either passed directly to the consumer in the form of a more expensive car, or it eats into the automaker's profit margins.
Which circles right back to our central theme today. Unless a company has the pristine capital resilience of a tech giant, These supply chain disruptions are just devastating to the bottom line.
Devastating.
And that brings us to the most devastating disruption of all. Because trade wars are fought with ledgers and tariffs, but real wars are fought with blockades and munitions. And the global economy is currently attempting to digest a major kinetic conflict. We are on day 63 of the war involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
Yeah. The human cost of the conflict is obviously profound. But looking strictly through the macroeconomic lens provided by our sources, the global architecture is buckling around one very specific geographic choke point, and that's the Strait of Hormuz.
It really is the most vital maritime artery on the planet for crude oil and liquefied natural gas. And right now, it is effectively closed for standard commercial business. The blockade mechanics are deeply complex. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, they are actively demanding transit tolls for safe passage through the strait.
Right.
And interestingly, they are demanding payment in either traditional fiat currency or cryptocurrency. But simultaneously, the U.S. Treasury Department has issued this uncompromising directive. Paying these tolls, regardless of the currency used, constitutes providing material support to a sanctioned entity. It's a direct violation of U.S. law.
It's an impossible position. Think about what this creates for the global maritime industry. A major shipping conglomerate, or, the syndicates at Lloyd's of London that insure these vessels, they are trapped between two catastrophic outcomes.
Yeah, what do they do?
Well, if they refuse to pay the toll, they face the kinetic threat of the IRGC seizing a multi-million-dollar supertanker and its cargo. But if they pay the toll, they face the financial wrath of the U.S. Treasury, which can freeze their dollar-denominated assets and lock them out of the global banking system completely. The risk is just unquantifiable.
So the ships just stop?
No, they reroute. The entire global shipping map is being redrawn in real time. Vessels that would normally transit the Middle East are now diverting south, sailing all the way around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa.
Wow. Walk us through the cascading economic effect of that diversion, because that's not a short detour.
No, it's massive. Adding the Cape of Good Hope to a voyage adds approximately 25 days to the delivery schedule. So first, you have the immediate spike in fuel consumption just to cover the extra thousands of miles. Second, marine insurance premiums skyrocket because these vessels are spending way more time on the open ocean.
Right, makes sense.
But the most destructive economic consequence is the trapping of capacity. Think about it. If a supertanker's round trip suddenly takes nearly a month longer, that vessel is unavailable to pick up its next scheduled load. You effectively shrink the global fleet's carrying capacity by a massive percentage without a single ship sinking.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, so freight rates just explode upward. And that cost is injected directly into the veins of the global inflation data.
Which makes finding an off-ramp so critical. According to our sources, Pakistani mediators have been attempting to broker a ceasefire. Iran actually put forward a new 10-point proposal.
They did, yeah.
And the demands include war reparations, the immediate lifting of Western economic sanctions, and crucially, a stipulation that any discussions regarding their nuclear enrichment program must be deferred.
And that deferment of the nuclear issue is precisely why the negotiations have hit a diplomatic wall. Yeah. President Trump has publicly stated he is not satisfied with the proposal, which cements the reality that allowing Iranian nuclear enrichment to continue unchecked is a complete non-starter for the administration.
Right. However, while the diplomatic front is totally stalled, Washington just executed a fascinating legal maneuver regarding the domestic authorization of the conflict.
The War Powers Act situation.
Exactly. This is regarding the War Powers Act. The president officially notified Congress today that hostilities have terminated for the purpose of the 60-day deadline. Explain to us how hostilities can be declared terminated while the Strait of Hormuz remains under blockade and the IRGC is literally still extorting supertankers.
It's all about legal definitions. The War Powers Act requires the president to withdraw forces after 60 days, unless Congress formally authorizes the use of military force. By legally defining the situation as terminated, the administration is relying on the fact that there has not been a direct kinetic exchange of fire since the temporary, localized ceasefire back in early April.
So they're exploiting a loophole.
Basically, yes. They are exploiting a legal definition to avoid a bruising constitutional battle with Congress over war authorization. Strategically, they are transitioning the engagement from a hot kinetic war into a prolonged, grinding economic siege.
Because the military blockade remains intact?
Exactly. The blockade is intact and the severe financial sanctions remain intact. In fact, they are expanding this strategy of economic statecraft globally. Our sources note the administration just imposed a fresh wave of severe sanctions on Cuba, specifically targeting its internal security apparatus and government loyalists.
So they are really weaponizing the dominance of the U.S. financial system everywhere. And you can see the collateral damage from all this in the commodity markets. I mean, the Bloomberg Commodity Index is up an astonishing 30% year to date.
The huge spike.
Brent crude, which is the global benchmark for oil pricing, rocketed past $126 a barrel at the peak of the panic. It has since settled near $108, primarily on the rumor of these Pakistani brokered peace talks. Now, obviously, the major energy conglomerates, your ExxonMobils, your Chevrons, they are posting record profits with crude trading in the triple digits.
They are capturing massive margins on the extraction side, certainly. However, even the energy titans eventually run into the brick wall of demand destruction.
Right.
Yeah. If oil sustains at $126 a barrel, the cost of gasoline at the local pump approaches $7 or $8 a gallon in many U.S. markets. And at that threshold, the average consumer simply stops driving. They cancel vacations, they consolidate trips. The consumer economy breaks, which eventually drags the price of oil back down. High prices are often the cure for high prices.
That's a great point. Which brings me to what is maybe the most baffling piece of data in our entire stack of sources.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the Strait of Hormuz is choked off, if supply chains are adding 25 days of transit time, and if oil is hovering near $108 a barrel, why isn't the stock market panicking? I checked the VIX today. The fear gauge actually dropped 10.2% down to 16.89. How do you square a plunging fear gauge with an expanding global war?
It seems crazy, but to understand this, we need to demystify what the VIX actually is. The Chicago Board Options Exchange Volatility Index doesn't measure current geopolitical bad news.
Okay.
It measures the market's expectation of future price turbulence over the next 30 days based on how investors are buying insurance, which are options contracts on the S&P 500. So a high VIX means investors expect wild, unpredictable swings. A low VIX, like 16.89, means they expect the market to remain relatively stable.
So wait, they just don't care about the war.
It is not apathy. It is ruthless assimilation. The market hates uncertainty more than it hates bad news. 2 months ago, when the kinetic strikes began, the uncertainty was massive. Like, could it trigger World War III? Would oil hit $200?
Right.
But now, on day 63, the parameters of the conflict are known. Investors have actively priced in what analysts call a structural war premium. They have mathematically accepted that $108 oil and 25-day shipping delays are the new permanent baseline of the global economy.
Wow.
Once the risk is quantified and accepted, the uncertainty vanishes, the VIX drops, and institutional capital turns its attention entirely back to corporate earnings power. And as we saw earlier with Apple and Alphabet, the earnings power of the companies that dictate the index remains virtually bulletproof.
Bulletproof for the tech monopolies, maybe. But for the companies operating in the gritty, physical reality of the traditional economy, that structural war premium is absolutely fatal.
Totally fatal.
We have breaking news today, May 1st, that Spirit Airlines is officially preparing to cease all operations and liquidate the company.
Yeah, and if Apple is the ultimate example of capital resilience, Spirit Airlines is the ultimate example of capital vulnerability. When the macroeconomic weather turns hostile, companies without deep cash reserves do not simply struggle, they vanish.
And the bailout talks between Spirit's board and the Trump administration have completely collapsed. This isn't a Chapter 11 reorganization where they emerge leaner, This is a full liquidation. When you look at the anatomy of this failure in our sources, it is the culmination of 3 distinct compounding crises.
Right, the perfect storm.
The first was regulatory. Back in 2024, the Biden administration's Justice Department aggressively sued to block Spirit's planned merger with JetBlue on antitrust grounds. They argued it would harm budget consumers. The block succeeded, leaving Spirit legally forced to remain an independent and financially bleeding entity.
And that regulatory block basically removed their primary lifeline. Then came the second crisis, which was the geopolitical energy shock we just analyzed.
Yeah.
The economics of the airline industry are driven by 2 key metrics: revenue per available seat mile and cost per available seat mile. Now, for legacy carriers like Delta or United, they have wide margins. Those are subsidized by premium business class cabins and really lucrative co-branded credit cards. So when jet fuel spikes, they can absorb the blow or just quietly pass it on to corporate travelers.
But Spirit is different.
Right. Spirit is an ultra-low-cost carrier. Their entire business model is predicated on packing maximum capacity into a cabin at rock-bottom ticket prices. Their margins are molecular. When the war in Iran sent jet fuel prices into the stratosphere, Spirit's cost to fly a seat instantly exceeded the revenue they could squeeze from a budget traveler. The basic arithmetic of their existence just broke.
Which leads right to the third crisis, the failure of the political rescue. Our sources show there was a proposed $500 million federal rescue package on the table to keep the planes flying. Why did it fall apart?
It failed because of the mechanics of corporate debt and political optics. To authorize a taxpayer-funded bailout, the government required Spirit's bondholders, the institutions that own the airline's debt, to take massive haircuts, meaning they would accept pennies on the dollar for what they were actually owed.
And they said no.
The bondholders absolutely refused. Simultaneously, a powerful coalition of Republican lawmakers and activist investors vehemently lobbied against the bailout. They argued that putting $500 million of public taxpayer money at risk to artificially sustain a failing private enterprise is a violation of free market capitalism.
It really highlights the difference between a camel and a hummingbird. Big tech is a camel, right? It drank deeply during the zero interest rate era, stored hundreds of billions in cash, and can now walk across the macroeconomic desert for years without taking a sip.
I like that.
But Spirit Airlines is a hummingbird. Its metabolism is so fast and its margins are so thin that if it stops consuming cheap nectar, in this case cheap jet fuel, and steady passenger volume, for even a few hours, it simply dies.
That is exactly the dynamic. And the liquidation has immediate real-world consequences for normal people. We're looking at the sudden loss of 14,000 to 17,000 jobs. Furthermore, removing Spirit's capacity from the market forces the budget travel industry to consolidate. Fewer seats available on fewer airlines guarantees that the cost of domestic travel will rise significantly for the average American consumer.
So, if you are the central bank, if you are the entity tasked with managing the money supply for this entire chaotic system, how do you possibly set a single interest rate that serves both the tech camel and the airline hummingbird?
It's nearly impossible. And the Federal Reserve is caught right in the middle of this. They are actually undergoing a historic and apparently bitter leadership transition right now.
Yeah, the timing of the transition could not be more critical. Jerome Powell's tenure as chairman of the Federal Reserve officially concludes on May 15th, and the Senate Banking Committee has just approved Kevin Warsh to succeed him and take control of the monetary levers.
And Powell's final days are really not reflecting a unified front.
Not at all. At the late April Federal Open Market Committee meeting, the Fed decided to hold their benchmark interest rate steady at a range of 3.5 to 3.75%. But the headline from that meeting was the dissents. There were 4 dissenting votes against holding rates steady. 4.
Yeah, that level of open rebellion within the normally consensus-driven FOMC is incredibly rare.
It's unheard of.
It really highlights the exact macroeconomic paradox we've been discussing. The committee is fracturing because the data is fracturing.
Right.
You had 3 officials, Kashkari, Hammock, and Logan, formally dissenting because they wanted to explicitly signal future rate hikes.
Right.
They were looking directly at the Strait of Hormuz blockade, the 30% spike in commodities, and the new 25% European auto tariffs, and concluding that massive structural inflation is about to wash over the U.S. economy.
But then you have Governor Miron, who dissented in the exact opposite direction. Miron wanted an immediate rate cut, arguing that the underlying labor market is actually showing severe hidden weakness. Powell himself has been uncharacteristically blunt, complaining publicly about intense political interference as his term winds down. So what exactly is the incoming Warsh era going to look like? Because our sources indicate Kevin Warsh operates on a fundamentally different economic philosophy.
Very different. Warsh is an advocate for a return to a strictly narrow mandate for the Fed. Over the last decade, the Fed has arguably expanded its focus to include broader social and economic equity metrics. Warsh wants to strip that all away and focus exclusively on the core statutory mandates, price stability and maximum employment.
Okay.
But his most consequential view, and this is the theory that will likely dictate global monetary policy for the remainder of the decade, is his absolute belief in the AI-linked productivity boom.
Walk us through the mechanics of that. How does, an algorithm generating code or writing emails translate to the Federal Reserve setting interest rates?
It revolves around the concept of aggregate supply and cost deflation. Warsh's thesis is that the massive capital expenditures we discussed earlier, Alphabet and Meta spending hundreds of billions on AI, are fundamentally transforming how businesses operate.
Right.
If an artificial intelligence platform allows a corporation to automate its logistics, optimize its supply chains, and double its operational output without hiring a single new employee, the underlying cost of production plummets. When businesses can produce more goods and services at a significantly lower cost, the macro-level result is disinflation. Warsh believes this technological leap is so powerful that it will naturally drive prices down across the entire economy.
Are we absolutely sure this isn't just like blind faith in Silicon Valley? Because he is betting that the deflationary power of software code is strong enough to battle the inflationary power of kinetic ore and $108 oil.
That tension is the ultimate macroeconomic battleground of 2026. Will the extreme exponential productivity gains generated by AI automation be enough to overwhelm the extreme physical costs generated by the global war premium, the rerouted supply chains, and the 25% protectionist tariffs? Warsh's models seem to suggest AI will actually win that tug of war.
Wow.
And if he is right, it provides the Fed with a theoretical justification to begin cutting interest rates much sooner than the inflation hawks like Kashkari would ever tolerate.
Software versus geopolitics. It's wild. But, while the Fed is debating economic philosophy domestically, there is a literal multi-billion-dollar sovereign currency war happening overseas. I want to shift focus to Japan because the scale of what their central bank just attempted is breathtaking.
It really is. The Bank of Japan is currently engaged in a desperate defense of their national currency against the overwhelming gravitational pull of the U.S. dollar.
Our sources indicate that during the Golden Week holiday, which is a period known for very thin trading volumes and low liquidity, the Japanese government intervened in the foreign exchange market. They spent an estimated $34 billion.
$34 billion in one session.
Yeah. We are talking about up to 6 trillion yen unloaded in a single trading session. The goal was to shock the market and defend the yen, and they temporarily succeeded in moving the exchange rate from a 160.72 down to 156 against the U.S. dollar.
And to truly appreciate the scale of that, you have to understand how a central bank physically intervenes in the FX market. The global foreign exchange market transacts over $7 trillion every single day. It is an absolute ocean of capital.
Right.
So when a currency is collapsing, a central bank must reach into its own foreign reserves. In Japan's case, primarily selling off U.S. Treasury bonds that they hold to acquire billions of U.S. dollars. They then take those dollars and flood the open market, aggressively buying up their own yen to artificially create massive demand and drive the price up.
It sounds incredibly expensive and, frankly, ultimately unsustainable. I mean, can a $34 billion intervention realistically reverse the trend when American interest rates are sitting at roughly 4% and Japanese rates are hovering near zero?
Mechanically, no.
Yeah.
It is the financial equivalent of standing in front of a freight train and trying to push it backward. It's true. Capital is ruthless. It flows automatically toward the environment that offers the highest yield and the greatest safety. Right now, the United States offers a massive yield advantage because of the Fed's 4% rates, combined with the unparalleled safety and growth potential of the tech fortresses we discussed. Institutional money will continually sell yen to buy dollars to invest in the American market.
So the intervention is just a smokescreen.
Basically, it is a stalling tactic designed to punish short sellers who were betting against the yen and to buy the Bank of Japan a few more weeks of breathing room. But unless Japan fundamentally alters its monetary policy and aggressively hikes its own interest rates, which risks collapsing their domestic debt-heavy economy, or unless Kevin Warsh immediately slashes U.S. rates, this intervention will ultimately fail. The underlying mechanics of yield differentials and U.S. capital resilience will simply reassert themselves and continue to crush foreign currencies.
Which brings us to our final lens for today.
Right.
We've talked about multi-trillion-dollar tech companies, global trade wars, and foreign exchange interventions, but I want to bring this all the way down to the ground floor. What does this wildly complex trimodal risk environment actually feel like for the average listener participating in the domestic U.S. economy right now?
It feels like an unsolvable contradiction. The real economy is experiencing a phenomenon that labor economists are defining as a low-hire, low-fire environment.
And the data reflects exactly that. Initial jobless claims, the number of people filing for unemployment benefits, are astonishingly low, sitting at just 189,000. Widespread systemic layoffs are simply not happening. People are keeping their jobs.
Right.
Yet the exact same data set reveals that manufacturing employment just contracted for the first time in 9 months. The factories are shrinking their workforce. How can employment be contracting if no one is getting fired?
We are witnessing the real-world manifestation of the productivity paradox, which is the precise phenomenon Kevin Warsh is building his monetary policy around. You have to look at the Purchasing Managers Index, or PMI.
Okay, remind us what that tracks.
The PMI surveys executives on their new orders, inventory levels, and production output. A baseline of 50 indicates a stable economy. Anything above 50 means the sector is expanding. The latest manufacturing PMI hit 54.5, representing a robust 4-year high in total output. Factories are physically producing more cars, more appliances, and more industrial goods than they have in half a decade.
Wait, so output is surging, but human employment in those factories is falling?
Yes. The robots have officially arrived on the factory floor.
Exactly. U.S. corporations are aggressively deploying the AI-driven automation and robotics they've been investing in. They are looking at the macroeconomic landscape and reacting defensively. They face a critical scarcity of skilled human labor, and they are terrified of the geopolitical shocks, the blocked straits and the 25% tariffs that threaten their supply chains. Their solution is to completely decouple their growth from human capital.
Because machines don't demand higher wages when inflation spikes.
Precisely. Human employees require healthcare, they require HR departments, and their wages must constantly adjust to absorb the inflation of that structural war premium. Automated capital does not. So companies are not firing the valuable human workers they already have, hence the low jobless claims. But they have instituted absolute freezes on new hiring.
Right.
When demand increases, they don't post a job listing. They buy a software license or a robotic arm. They are choosing capital resilience over labor expansion. And that urge for resilience is being accelerated by domestic instability as well. The economic anxiety isn't just about foreign wars. There is intense political and legal friction happening right here at home.
Oh, absolutely.
Look at the breaking news out of Louisiana today. The governor just unilaterally suspended all congressional primary elections in the state in response to a complex Supreme Court decision regarding redistricting maps.
Yeah, that was huge.
It's an unprecedented move that instantly triggered massive, paralyzing lawsuits from the ACLU and the NAACP.
And that kind of domestic institutional friction feeds directly back into the economic feedback loop we've been describing. Imagine you are the CEO of a mid-sized logistics company. You are watching a trade war erupt with your European partners, a kinetic war throttle your Middle Eastern shipping routes, and fundamental electoral chaos erupt in your own domestic legal system.
Yeah, I'd be terrified.
Right. Uncertainty is the ultimate enemy of corporate expansion. When the horizon is entirely obscured by political and economic smoke, you do not take risks on expanding your human workforce. The uncertainty is the final catalyst driving the automation boom.
So all roads lead back to capital resilience.
Hmm.
We promised you a deep dive into a tri-modal risk environment today, and we have certainly mapped the boundaries of the paradox. We have explored a reality on May 1st, 2026, where the immense gravitational pull of big tech's AI infrastructure build-out is almost single-handedly keeping the American stock market indices at record highs.
Yeah, that capitalization-weighted illusion.
Exactly. But beneath the surface of that illusion, we have exposed the deep structural fractures of the real economy. A punitive 25% forced localization trade war with Europe, a 63-day kinetic blockade of the global energy supply chain, and real-world corporate casualties like the liquidation of Spirit Airlines.
The ultimate takeaway for you, whether you are rebalancing a retirement portfolio, managing a small business payroll, or simply trying to navigate the evening news without feeling overwhelmed, is that the old barometers of economic health are broken.
Completely broken.
You must fiercely separate the concept of index performance from the reality of underlying economic stability. They are no longer correlated. In this decade, capital resilience, the ability to self-fund innovation, command pricing power, and replace vulnerable labor with automated efficiency is the only metric of survival that matters.
It is the ultimate difference between the luxury sports car soaring down the highway and the smoke quietly filling the cabin from the engine fire. Which leaves me with one final, deeply provocative thought for you to carry with you today.
Okay.
We are watching a historic collision. The greatest technological leap in human history, the AI productivity boom, is currently going head-to-head with the most severe deglobalization and geopolitical fracturing the world has experienced since the darkest days of the Cold War. Right now, the tech fortresses are winning that tug-of-war. They are masking the pain. But if the AI revolution hits a wall, if those models fail to deliver the exponential profits required to justify hundreds of billions in server costs, and the tech giants finally stumble, what exactly is holding the rest of the global economy up?
That is the trillion-dollar question that should keep every policymaker awake at night.
And on that lingering note of uncertainty, we are going to wrap up today's deep dive. Thank you for joining us as we unpack the mechanics behind the headlines. Keep an eye on the underlying data, stay curious, and keep questioning the illusion of the index. We will catch you next time.